This kid thing's really thrown me. I'm a sales girl, not a brain trust.
You'll do okay. These things just show how quick you can think, not how much you know.
No.
Please, no talking.
120 pounds.
Right for your height and age.
Next, please.
Catherine Johnson. 162 pounds.
Sorry, 10 pounds overweight.
But it's just a few pounds, Doctor.
Well, we give you the benefit of 15 pounds one way or the other, Mrs. Johnson. You're still overweight. Take off those extra pounds and try again.
I can have another chance?
Yes. Men folks in the Army?
2 sons.
For those who meet the enlistment requirements, the oath of allegiance.
And I do solemnly swear
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the United States of America.
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the United States of America.
And that I will serve them honestly and faithfully against all their enemies whomsoever.
And that I will serve them honestly and faithfully against all their enemies whomsoever.
That I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me.
That I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me.
According to the regulations of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the Articles of War.
According to the regular Army Auxiliary Corps and the Articles of War.
More recruits arriving every day.
So we're going to go ahead and get started here, but I like starting, and that whole video is actually available on YouTube. It's about 20 minutes long, but it's one of the first recruiting videos from 1943 about the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And it's a little hokey. It's probably on par with the driver's ed video, but it's really important because, as you can see there, one of the things that we just watched was them taking the oath of allegiance, which every veteran here has been through. So one of the biggest misconceptions that, before we get started today, I start with that because I get told all the time, these women are not veterans. These women just sorted mail. They were just clerks. Even with the most recent movie coming out about the 6888, people were saying, these are not really veterans. You know, Tyler Perry has us all over here thinking these women were veterans and combat. All they did was sort mail. But as you can see from that brief clip I just shared and what we'll be talking about today, and I'm assuming the veterans here probably know this better than I can explain it, what you do to serve your country matters less than the fact that you simply did it. And these women that we'll be discussing today, they showed up and they did anything that was asked of them. So today, just going to introduce myself real quick. My name is Mel Bloom. I am the founder of 350 Girls. I'm a Massachusetts local. I grew up in the Metro West area. And when I was in my early 20s, I went and joined the Air Force. I don't know why. My parents don't know why. But I went and joined the Air Force and spent 3 years stationed in North Dakota. For those who don't know where that is, it's Canada and then south about 3 miles. But when I was in, I've always been interested in history. I'm from Massachusetts. You either find a passion for history or you move. But I mostly, knew about the Revolutionary War and Deborah Sampson to some extent. But when I was in basic training, we barely talked about women in the military. We talked about the Doolittle Raiders, Hap Arnold, and other than that, there was not much. And when I asked my TI, when did women come into the service, he just kind of shrugged and said, you get Tom Pass in a couple days and there's a library on base, but good luck. So I refer to myself as an accidental historian. I'm actually studying architecture and engineering, but I was so frustrated with a lack of history and a lack of visibility when I was on active duty and after I came back to the civilian world that I launched 350 Girls about 3 years ago to address what I was not seeing so that another generation of female veterans would not go through that same feeling of sitting there in basic training and wondering where their history was. So this is one of the recruiting posters from the early first stages of the war. And I love this quote. It isn't just my brother's country or my husband's country. It's my country as well. And so the war wasn't just their war, it was my war, and I needed to serve in it. And this was a major shift in social customs for this time period. As I'm sure everyone's noticed in the last few weeks, there's a lot of social and political upheaval going on, which kind of makes it a little bit more easy for me to explain what it might have been like in late 1941, early 1942. This was a very chaotic time in history, and when the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was first proposed, they referred to it as the Petticoat Army. So when I started looking into this, mostly while I was freezing cold and bored in North Dakota, it was that or weightlifting, and I preferred, there's not much else to do in North Dakota. But when I first started researching this, the first part of the war, end of 1941, early 1942, it's really complicated. And I won't pretend it didn't scare the living daylights out of me. But one of the important things about the 350 Girls mission is that we focus a lot on context. We make sure that women's military history is taught thoroughly and within the appropriate setting that demonstrates the scale of their service. So studying the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the end of 41, early 42, that gives us the context to study what became the Women's Army Corps, the Navy Waves, the Coast Guard Spars, the Marine Corps Reserves, women's service that came after the Integrated Service Act of 48, up through to my service in a contemporary time. So it all starts with the Women's Army Corps in early 1942. So we need to study the Women's Army Corps and our local history to understand the significance of it with what it means to serve as a woman and to be a veteran. Now, to give an example about all the upheaval that was going on around the development of the WAAC, it's important to understand just how unusual it was to have women serving in that capacity. Women in the military is not a new concept. We've actually been serving since the beginning of the Revolutionary War. When I mentioned earlier, Deborah Sampson. But Deborah Sampson was a woman serving as a man, and there was actually ways that women were serving as women in the Revolutionary War and from then on. Women have always had gender-specific roles in a military context, mostly nurses and cooks. They could do laundry, seamstress. They held sutler's license. In World War I, we had women that served in the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Army as clerical roles, and we also had women serving in the Navy and Army Nurse Corps. But what was radical about what was happening in 1942 is that women were being incorporated into the Army into roles that they had never done before. So this new slogan that's coming out in the early days of the war is "Free a man to fight," which means that women were taking on roles that had previously been considered masculine. They held much more traditional roles as well. Expected of women, they were doing a good amount of clerical work, secretarial, and cooking, but they were also serving as mechanics for aircraft and vehicles. They were doing code breaking, overseeing major supply chains and logistics, packing parachutes. They were training men, and that's just scratching the surface of some of the many jobs they held. And while there isn't an exact number on the percentage of roles that women took over in the military, we do know that in the civilian sector before World War I, women made up about 20% of the workforce. By the end of World War II, women made up 85% of the civilian workforce, doing jobs that had previously been considered men's roles. So when people tell me that, oh, well, women were doing women's work in World War II, they had all taken jobs from a man. So unless men were doing women's work first, a lot of what women were doing was completely redefining gender roles for this time period. So based on that, and based on the idea that gender roles were changing and that the war was coming to the United States, Edith Norris Rogers, who's pictured here at center, I'm sure if you're from Massachusetts, you've heard of her. She was a Massachusetts representative who is often referred to as the mother of the military. She was well aware that war was on the horizon in 1941, and she proposed legislation to create the women's non-combative role. She was called paranoid and anticipatory, and the proposal was shut down. So when Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, she got to be probably like the first woman on record, like official record, saying "I told you so." And I checked; it's in the congressional transcript. So we know that in December 1942, she was able to be like, "Hey, we talked about this. Let's make it happen." And Edith Norris Rogers is actually somewhat well known in Massachusetts, but not for her work with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, She did a lot of really incredible things during her 35 years in Congress, but in Massachusetts, she's best known for her work on the GI Bill and for increasing the quota of immigrants who are fleeing persecution in Europe. She is little known for her work with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the WAAC. And the VA in Bedford is actually named for her, but there is no sign anywhere in the building mentioning her role with the women. So to give you an idea of what my organization does, we actually recently set up our exhibit in the lobby of the VA talking to people about her role with the military. And so many people are coming through the door that day saying they had no idea. So it's an important thing that we talk about what she did for women. And like Edith Nurse Rogers here, Fort Devens, as being someplace that women were stationed in World War II, that's history that is also not well known. Back in November on Veterans Day, we announced that we were going to be focusing our 2025 theme. We decided we were going to go with an entire focus of She Served Here. So women's history in New England. And some of the initial feedback that we got was questioning if there really was enough history in New England alone. And well, if you're doing World War II history, maybe you should focus on something like Normandy. And at least Washington, D.C., something that people think of when they think of military service. And in response to that, there's actually 10 locations across New England where women's military history is made here. And so we'll be talking about the Fort Devens today and what women were doing there, but women were also in the Army that were, they were at Bangor, Maine, they were at Hanscom Air Force Base, they were stationed at Westover Field in Chicopee, and they were also assigned to different offices around Boston. And if we start looking at like the Navy and the Coast Guard, they're on the Cape, they're in Newport, they're in Connecticut. And the Marines were assigned to Vermont for some reason, but they were there. And the Navy officers actually completed their training in Northampton, Massachusetts. So, while I understood and heard that feedback, there's actually a lot more history about women serving at Fort Devens than there is at Normandy. So we're going to talk about Fort Devens and the WAAC today. There have been women at Fort Devens since the beginning. So Fort Devens was originally Camp Devens. It was opened in World War I. And from the beginning, there was Army nurses here at Fort Devens. And there's actually a uniform in their museum back there, which I really encourage everyone goes to look at. And even though there was women here from the start, the fort was relatively ill-equipped to host the WAAC in the end of 1942 when they were announced they were coming here. But this typifies the struggles of late 1941, early 1942 to create a non-combative role for women. The logistics to be sorted were all over the place, and they actually had about less than 6 months to truly organize. Sure. Edith put this legislation forth in end of December 1941, and they assumed it was going to be passed, but they had to plan just in case it might be passed with the anticipation that maybe it wouldn't be. So while the legislation is working through Congress, a officer in the War Department, Lieutenant Colonel Gilman Mudgett, actual name, he was assigned to become what was called the pre-planner for the WAAC, and his orders were to build a fire under WAAC planning. And I have a couple of veterans here, right? Has anyone here ever seen the military pull something off in 3 months from start to finish? I don't think this has happened before or since, but they pulled this off between January and May of 1942. And in that span of 3 months, let's talk about what they had to do real quick. They had to write a whole new set of regulations because these women were not going to be officially in the Army, so they had to write a whole new rank structure and regulations. They had to decide on and order uniforms. They had not gotten funding yet, but they had to be ready to go in case that funding came through. They had to find housing, determine which jobs the women were going to be doing, set applicant standards, recruit, and establish a training program, and find a training location. And this took place in about 4 months. So from early February until the end of April, there was so much work to be done to plan for something that may or may not even happen. And because these women were auxiliary members, everything had to be rewritten. And the Army actually gets a bit of an unfair amount of scrutiny for how the WAAC was established. But like I said, they were doing everything from the start. There was very limited precedent. Even with the British having brought women in as early as 1939, Ovetta Culp Hobby did end up going over to England to see how they were running their programs, so they had a little bit of precedent, but the auxiliary really presented a challenge in that these women were never really intended to be equal with the Army, so everything had to be created in these 4 months during pre-planning. So this is the definition of building the plane while in flight. And for comparison, 2 months after they announced the signing of this bill in May of 1942, the Navy created their own program for women, but instead of it being an auxiliary, they created the Women's Naval Reserve. So women had the same ranks, the same pay, and it made for a much smoother transition because they could just put the women in with the men in the Naval Reserve. They didn't have to work as hard as the Army had by creating an auxiliary. So the Army learned everything the hard way. And I want to share this. I always like to talk about this because I said major, things were changing so dramatically in this country at this point. We have the article here from the Boston Globe about the new auxiliary. We see them promoting this is Canadian. So the Canadians are starting to bring women in. They're starting to graduate the first Tuskegee pilots, which up until that point had been a radical idea. And they're starting to bring women in other minorities. This is something that if we had not gone to war, that we would have likely not seen for many more years to come. Mm-hmm. So war really forced these changes socially. So in February of 1942, Ovetta Culp Hobby, who is pictured there in the middle, she was the wife of Texas Governor William Hobby, and she was in charge of running the Women's Interest Section in the War Department. She was selected to be the first director of the Women's Army Corps. And the word director is used to refer to the heads of the women's branches in World War II, even if they weren't an auxiliary unit. And director is a good example of the WAAC rank. She was not considered an officer. She was not commissioned as an officer until July 1943, when the WAAC became the Women's Army Corps. But during her time at the helm at the WAAC, she was Director Hobby. Director in WAAC rank is the equivalent to Colonel in Army rank. So there's a whole different set of ranks that the WAAC had to learn. And according to Maddie Treadwell's History of the WAAC, which was written in 1953, when they selected Director Hobby there to be the head of the first group of women going into the military, this book states, Mrs. Hobby now found herself in a strange status. She was the unannounced head of a non-existent office which could not become WAAC headquarters until passage of legislation at an uncertain future date, but which, meanwhile, must perfect very complete plans requiring the formal coordination of many department agencies. So she had her work cut out for her. And one of the first challenges that she had to navigate was assignments. What are the women going to be doing? And there was consensus that this was going to be a non-combat role, but what a non-combat role was in February 1942 was not clear. And because things were not confusing enough, and this is the part where this research started to scare me, the Army decided to restructure itself. This is also really the first war where the Army Air Force has been a part of it. We had the Army flying in World War I a little bit, but this was the first war where we're really introducing the Army Air Force. So that made things even more confusing. And that was when we get the Services Supply, which later got renamed Supply Force or Service Force. We get the Army Ground Force and the Army Air Force. And they decided that the women were going to be involved with the Service Force. And I'm going to keep this simple to make sure no one else here needs therapy, because I did after this research a little bit. So we're going to keep it simple. The WACs were determined they were going to be assigned to the Service of Supply. But assigning them to the Service of Supply, and I can see why they renamed it, this allowed the Service of Supply to take over some of the logistical concerns in planning the WAC, which at this point still did not officially exist. Now in April, the pre-planners selected Fort Des Moines as the first training center. Recruiting guidelines were drawn up, decisions were made regarding the uniform, but the uniforms could not be ordered until the bill passed, and recruits could not report to Fort Des Moines, the WAC regulations could not be published, Everything was in place and ready to go for what was nicknamed WAAC D-Day, and that was the day that the legislation ultimately passed. And newspapers are reporting in the early days of 1942 that women were already going to recruitment centers and writing their statesmen saying, hey, when this new auxiliary drops, how can I help? How can I enlist? So everything was primed and ready to go when WAAC D-Day finally came. The other thing that's really unique about the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and ultimately the WAAC is that this bill included African American women. That had been advocated for by Mary McLeod Bethune. That's her picture there. If anyone saw the 688 film recently, she was played by Oprah in that film. She was the biggest advocate to make sure African American women were included in this new role. There was a cap on how many women total could serve. Originally, the WAAC was only supposed to be 150,000 women, and only 10% of that could be African American. Mary McLeod Bethune selected the first 40 African American women to serve as officers, among them Charity Adams, who also from the 688. And she later made sure that she went to Fort Des Moines to make sure they were being treated fairly. The Army was the only one to incorporate African American women from the start. The Navy waited until 1944, 1945, end of 44 into 45 to bring African American women into the Coast Guard and the Navy. The Marines didn't at all during World War II. The first woman, African American woman to serve in the Marines was 1949. So the fact that the women in the Army were integrated like this, it was not considered. This had not been done before. And that's all thanks to Mary McLeod Bethune there. So by the end of April, the WAAC was as ready as they could be. May 12, 1942, D-Day, the WAAC D-Day, Roosevelt signed H.R. 6293 with a very abbreviated title of A Bill to Establish a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps for Service within the United States Army. Try saying that 5 times fast. The WAAC D-Day had arrived. Now, this is some couple of pictures from the first summer. This is great shot of the uniform. They later figured out that the recruitment was being hampered by the uniform. I can't tell why, but this was one of the first uniforms that they were issued. And there's Charity Adams on the end there. And I mentioned Edith Norris Rogers. This is one of very few pictures of her. So in summer of 1942, first recruitment numbers are up. Training's been launched at Fort Des Moines. Also in July of 1942, we get the creation of the Navy Waves. The Women's Naval Reserve was nicknamed the Waves for women accepted for voluntary emergency services. They did not like short names in World War II. So we got acronyms for everything. But this is summer 1942. Things are continuing to change. And recruiting was supposed to be, I don't think the Army was really prepared for the interest that women were going to show in serving their country. And also at the end of summer in 1942, we get the first of the female pilots. The Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron was forming up. And that was one of the programs that was a precursor to the WAAC. So we have gone from having no women in the military at Pearl Harbor, and looking at summer 1942, we've got women in the Navy, women in the Army, and they're starting to create a pilot role for women. So this is 6-7 months into the war, and women's roles have changed dramatically already. Now, the WAACs first arrived at Fort Devens in November of 1942, and I'm using a lot of newspaper clippings because this was very widely reported, but there's not a lot of photos, and in the last couple weeks, a lot of women's sources have been up for edits. A lot of web pages have been taken down to ensure compliance. So most of what I have today are going to be newspaper clippings because those sources which had made the WAAC research so much more accessible are currently offline. So I appreciate everyone being here today, but so we can have these conversations while we're limited on public sources for this history. But we are going to be using a lot of those newspaper clippings for that reason. But we do get a lot of really good information about when things were happening here at Fort Devens from the newspaper. The Boston Daily Globe was reporting on it near daily. I can tell you everything that was happening at Fort Devens throughout the war. If they got a shipment of toilet paper, it was in the newspaper. So the newspapers were incredibly helpful in determining the timeline here at Fort Devens. So then Fort Devens, it was announced in early November 1942 that the WACs are coming to Fort Devens. And as women's roles are expanding, the Marines are now bringing women into service, and the Coast Guard is now creating their Coast Guard Reserve. The Marines didn't officially launch until 43, but at this point in World War II, we have women in every branch or plan for every branch. And in December of 42, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots are launched. So in the span of a year, we've gone from having the idea of women being in the military as being laughable to now we've got women serving across all branches. And the Army was here at Fort Devens. The first full company of WACs, 150 women, was going to be coming here. Now, what was happening at this time,
I'm sorry, I'm just noticing, they still called them the girls.
that's why we're 350 girls.
Exactly.
Because that was considered kind of an insult, and they ended up running with it. So that's where we get our name from, was they were calling them the girls or
Is that a problem, calling them the girls?
It was a way of showing them they didn't respect them and they didn't take them seriously. It was considered an insult. You know, little lady is another one we hear in the records a lot. Just another way of not treating them as soldiers.
I don't find it offensive.
Especially once they made it a battle cry, I would agree with that. And that's why, I mean, we're 350 girls. We call ourselves the girls all the time. So we would agree. We agree that it's something that we can wear with pride. And what's interesting about what was happening at this time is they had around the time that they were coming to Fort Devens, they had very quickly outgrown that initial pre-planning. The initial number had been 15,000 women in the auxiliary, and they were being turned away by the thousands at recruiting stations. And the handful of roles that the WAC were allowed to do, so things like cooks, drivers, some switchboard roles, there wasn't enough jobs. There's only so many men they could send overseas, and they were also they didn't have anywhere to put them. There's a lot of evidence from this point in the war that the WAC needed to evolve. One of the other things that was becoming apparent at this time was that they were not subject to government life insurance or overseas pay. In November and December of 1942, there was actually plans in place for the WAC to go overseas to Algiers at the end of 1942. The first WACs arrived in Africa in December of 42 without government life insurance or overseas pay. And when I was researching the WAC regulation, there is a section on death gratuity, so I was thinking maybe I got it wrong and they did get a death gratuity. No, the death gratuity section of the WAC regulations is about what happens if they become a widow. So if their husband dies, they could get the death gratuity for up to 6 months. And I looked into it, and there's no death gratuity for the WAC. So if she was killed, her husband, her family, there was no death gratuity. They would have had to pay for their own funeral, and that was what they all signed up for. They were willing to do this to serve their country. So that's one issue. We also have a serious lack of equipment and uniform items. During a December 1942 visit to Fort Des Moines, Director Hobby found that illness was on the rise and that many of the WACs were lacking appropriate clothing for cold weather. So when the second training center opened at Daytona Beach in December 1942, they also faced a shortage of clothing, mostly shoes and places to put them, and coats were also in short supply. So the WAC, which had planned for everything and put everything in place to launch when the bill was signed, they had essentially failed to account for the increasingly high number of recruits, and expansion and evolution was incredibly necessary for the WAC to succeed. So the WACs who were coming to Fort Devens, they were not here at first for training. They referred to the end of the year, they referred to it as the plan of 1,000,000 WACs. And they refer to this as the plan for 1,000,000 WACs. They never got 1,000,000 WACs. The total number of women in World War II was 350,000. So they went from planning from 15,000 WACs to 1 million. I think there's probably a middle number they could have gone with, but 1 million was better than 15,000. And one of those steps was the adjutant general's. His office was developing a list of jobs that would be suitable for women. Another piece of that was finding additional training locations. But when the first women came to Fort Devens, it was not as a training center, it was as a post assignment for them. So these are women who had already been through training. This was their duty station. At this point, Fort Des Moines was still the primary location for training. Daytona Beach was the second, and they opened Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia as the third training center. And when I say these women were stationed here, this was their duty station, they arrived on December 31st, 1942. It was in the newspaper. And there's 151 WACs at first. And there's actually this was the largest company of WACs to be assigned here. This was the first full company of WACs to be assigned to any Army post. So there were 151 of them. There were 149 auxiliaries, which is the WAC equivalent rank for private, and 2 officers. They arrived to establish the 34th WAC Post Headquarters Company, and in early January, the assignments for these WACs were as follows. 18 were assigned to the Quartermaster Motor Pool to drive staff cars and trucks, 5 were assigned to the Post Headquarters, 8 at the Service Club, 6 at the Post Signal, 6 at the Station Hospital, and 1 at the Quartermaster Headquarters. So we're seeing that the jobs that they are doing has now been expanded on. And all of these women replaced a male soldier who was then sent on combat duty. By early 1943, the WAC were allowed to serve as clerks, machine operators, cooks, bakers, stewards, dietitians, hygienists, pharmacists, telephone operators, post exchange assistants, laundry workers, accountants, drivers, and bookkeepers. That list would grow throughout the war. By the end of the war, there was very few jobs in the Army the women were not doing. So they're there for their duty station, but then in spring of 1943, it was announced that Fort Devens was going to become the 4th training center. So after Fort Oglethorpe, now we're opening a training center at Fort Devens. Now, when I say newspapers, everything. And I'm not 100% certain where on base the women's quarters were, but they had to establish separate barracks for them and keep it very separate from the men. So this is also coming at a time where recruitment takes a major hit. The WAC, even with the expansion plans and the trying to incorporate 1 million WACs, they were clearly lagging behind the growth and the progress of the women who were serving in the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the Marine Corps. So there was conversations happening at this time about how the women had clearly earned full military status, but at this point they're still auxiliaries. And they had proven themselves beyond capable of the task that they had been assigned. On the other hand, managing an auxiliary was becoming quite complicated. The other branches, like I said, the Navy, the Marines, they had proven that women could serve as equal. It also made things a lot easier to manage, fund, and organize. And I mentioned earlier that the WACs had a completely different rank structure. So there's Army rank and WAC rank. And that may not seem super difficult, but when it comes to cohesion and functionality, having 2 totally different rank structures is really confusing. Army rank, 2nd lieutenant, but the WAC equivalent of that was a 3rd officer. The women were not enlisted, they were enrollees. A private was called an auxiliary, and a sergeant was called a leader. The equivalent of a major in the WAC was a field director. So legislation was created in March 1943 to bring the women into the Army completely. Not adjacent to the Army, but fully incorporated as it was being done in the other organizations. I said that recruiting took a bit of a hit in 1943. So in 1943, we have something that we now call the Great Slander Campaign. The WAC were subject to rumors of promiscuity, lesbianism, heavy drinking, and prostitution. And I'm bringing this up in relation to Fort Devens because it speaks about how women were received, which is one of the questions we get quite often. How were the women received by their male counterparts? And we've heard enough stories that, for the most part, the women felt they were respected, but the Great Slander Campaign was originally thought to have been originated from a foreign adversary to put a dent in morale, to put a dent in recruiting to hinder the war effort. So the military was actually investigating to figure out where the source of these rumors were from. And the military investigators actually traced the root of many of these rumors to Fort Devens. So the hospital here at Fort Devens was the origin of many of these rumors. And I mentioned Maddie Treadwell's book at the beginning. She has a section on the Great Slander Campaign in which she wrote, soldiers in the Fort Devens area were credited by investigators with originating the rumor that fantastic numbers of pregnant WAACs had been sent back to Lovell General Hospital from North Africa. Agents descended on the hospital records without prearrangement and reported not a single record of a pregnant WAAC was found. And soldiers at Fort Devens were also found by investigators to be spreading rumors that the WAACs were using contraceptives and that they were issued. And also that venereal disease was high amongst the WAACs. So these rumors were completely debunked, but it had a significant impact on recruiting. And I mean, especially if you were going to send your daughter off to war, which is a big appeal in recruiting, morality and making sure they were going to be a good, wholesome, chaperone, this put a major dent in WAAC recruiting. And we have read accounts from several women who said that their experience with male soldiers were okay for the most part. But one of the other things that we've read, and I've found in my time doing this, is that there was a good number of men who resented women from taking their safe desk jobs and sending them on to much more dangerous assignments. And I recognize this does not minimize anyone's grandfather's or great-grandfather's contributions to what they did at the war. It's normal to be afraid. But women took a lot of the blame for sending men to what they considered being sent to their deaths. And women took quite a bit of hate for that, even though it was just that's the nature of war, and we would have lost this war if not for the women. So depending on who you ask, they either had a good experience with the men or not so great. So the damage to their morality really persisted through the end of the war. And you see all these different competitions kind of popping up in the newspapers where they're polling people and asking them, are you joining the WAAC? Are you joining the WAAC? Why or why not? And they were really trying to figure out, what's pulling people into other, into like the Marine Corps versus the Army. A lot of it came down to the uniform, actually. A lot of people joined the Navy or the Marine Corps because they had a really fashionable uniform, whereas the WAAC were still using their very early pre-planned khaki potato sacks. And that's actually a quote that they were the same potato sack is probably one of the nicer ways to put it, but the early uniforms for the Women's Army Corps could not compete with the Marine Corps. We still can't compete with the Marine Corps. So in July of 1943, we get what's called the Women's Army Corps. And I still have not found a good way to talk about the WAAC and the WAC. So we're now talking about the Women's Army Corps going forward. But in 1943, in July, they passed the WAAC law. So we're no longer talking about the WAAC, we're talking about WACs. And in October of 1944, the first African American attachment arrived at Fort Devens. And just kind of a heads up, I did block it, but some of the language in the newspaper clippings on the next slide are period correct, but not socially acceptable now. So I just want to give a quick warning before I switch. This is probably the first thing you're going to find when you search Fort Devens in the WAAC. So in October of 1944, we get the first 100 African American WAAC at Fort Devens. And they had been promised skilled work here. They were going to get good job training, and instead they were put into janitorial roles. So whereas the white WACs are being trained in technical and jobs that would give good career options, the African American women were working in the kitchen, scrubbing floors, peeling potatoes, all the really dirty jobs. And in the spring of 1945, 54 of these African American women went on strike, refused to go to work. One of the other complaints they had is that while the WACs were given uniform issue, the African American WACs were given these loose smocks that they were expected to wear for work. So there was a lot of their complaints just went unheard, and in March of 1945 they ended up going on strike. So they did end up getting court-martialed. They were charged with dereliction of duty and insubordination. It became a media sensation. And what's important to think about at this time is that this is March 1945. And the walkout at Fort Devens happened on March 9th, 1945. And what was happening at the same time is that the 688, so the first African American unit to deploy to England, they arrived in England in 1945, first and only African American unit to go overseas, and they actually officially formed up on March 4th. So within the span of a week, we've got these two major headlines, and there was a lot of eyes on these two cases. We have the women back here in the States that are going on strike for mistreatment, and we have the first group of women to deploy overseas, and they're trying to get their feet on the ground and get established. So there was a lot of really negative, nasty press coming out at this time, and I tried to find ones that, were not, they give you an idea of what's going on, but some of the things that they said about them were absolutely horrendous. This is from an Atlanta article. So what was happening here at Fort Devens was making national and international news. And Dr. Bethune, who I mentioned at the beginning, she was a very vocal advocate for getting the charges dropped against these women. And in the records here, I actually had the opportunity to come and read the transcripts of the trial, and there was so much pressure on them on the Army to drop the charges. And they originally were going to sentence these women to a year of hard labor, dishonorable discharges, but due to peer pressure and letters and the media, they ended up dropping all charges and the women returned to duty. Now, I don't want to end on that note because it's kind of a grim look at what it means to serve, but being in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was not an easy thing to do. And they didn't have any of the advantages of the groups that came after them. They had to really fight for every single thing that they earned and that they had to prove. One of the things I run into teaching women history is that people kind of have a sort of skewed perspective on women at war. I get asked a lot about Rosie the Riveter. In recent years, more and more people are becoming familiar with the Women's Army service pilots, which is phenomenal. But a lot of times when I talk to people about women in World War II, there's kind of this sort of cheerful swing dancing and pinup girls perspective of what it was like to be a woman in the military or living through this time period. And what we do with 350 Girls is we try and ensure that these women are remembered for the challenges and the struggles and what they persevered through. Because without it, I use the word context at the beginning, we can't truly understand the success that their service was. We get the Integrated Service Act in 1948, not because their service was easy and they fought for that. The women who served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps set the precedent, and all the women who came after them, the women in the Marines, the Navy, the Coast Guard, they fought every single day of their service to earn a place in this military. And I love this quote from Oveta Kolpati because it's something that I have shared a lot recently. Women who stepped up were measured as citizens of the nation. Not as women, this was a people's war and everyone was in it. Serving in the military was an opportunity for these women to show that they could serve, and they proved themselves. Not to get, like I said, I'm trying not to get emotional. It's been really important the last few weeks to have conversations like this, to talk about the hard things, the challenges that these women went through. It's important to talk about where they served close to home because now we know about about our communities and how it played a role in World War II. But normally when I end a speech, I encourage everyone to find a book, do some further digging. After the 688 film came out, we were getting so many emails, questions about the Women's Army Corps. And it has been a big way to think about the fact that right now, if you were to search the Women's Army Corps, there's very limited information available. So I'm hoping that you all stick around for a little bit. I'm going to be set up out there for a little while. But my ask today is that while we are in a period where this history is no longer accessible, I ask that you take what I'm sharing today and what I'll talk to you about at our display and help keep this history out there. This is so important. If you know a female veteran or you know somebody who wants to go into the service, it matters a lot when you don't see your history included. So I thank you all for being here today, and I told myself I wasn't going to get emotional. I'm a little emotional. Thank you. It's really all I have. I think I'm really the best way I can end that. But thank you all for coming and learning about these women. I hope I didn't give any of you guys anxiety over the early days of World War II. I have a recommendation for a great therapist, if yes. But thank you. Any questions I can take at this time?
What kind of other groups or venues do you give this presentation?
So we are quite literally all over the map. We are going, next week we will be at the American Heritage Museum. So by representing the 350,000 women who served, it gives us a chance to take on pretty much any role that existed in World War II. So next week we're going to be at the American Heritage Museum. It's the 80th anniversary of Iwo Jima. I will be representing the flight nurses because talk about history that's not known. There was women at Iwo Jima. There was flight nurses. So we'll be at the American Heritage Museum. We'll be at, let's see, I'm trying to think. We have so many events. I'm traveling to Atlanta in a couple weeks. Mostly do events like this, local museums. We did the Hanscom Air Force Ball last year. We brought all of our Air Force uniforms from World War II up to the 70s. So we make this work in quite a variety of events and venues. And we do about 3 or 4 events a month. So a lot of museums, that's the mission for us. A lot of museums that we work with, they want to incorporate women's history, but they don't have the artifacts or they don't have someone that can interpret it. So we get quite a bit of our business from a museum calling us and saying, hey, Women's History Month is coming up, or hey, we want to do something about the Navy waves. We've done a couple of programs now at the Naval War College Museum down in Newport. So a lot of times we're kind of filling in those gaps for displays. We also do presentations like this one. We're going to be posting our full speaker list on our website in the next week or two. Our biggest event this year, we're actually hosting our own symposium because we went to so many different events where they said it's going to be focused on women in the military, and then they put Eleanor Roosevelt and Lee Miller and other civilians in there. So we got told, there's no way you can do a conference or an event all about women in the military. There's just no way. We are. We have 3 incredible speakers coming, and it'll be at Hotel Northampton, which is where the Waves were stationed in World War II. So to answer your question, I'm sorry, it's a little longer than it could have been, but we go everywhere. We're open-minded, we're willing to try new things and go to new places, and anywhere that we can get an opportunity to talk about this history, we're more than happy to.
The black women, when they joined the Corps, were they separate but equal, or were they integrated?
They were separate. That's why they had the first black officers, is they were going to be overseeing their units. So we don't see full integration in the armed forces until 1948. And I was actually just at the Truman White House in Key West, and they talked about his crazy wild summer where he signed the Integrated Service Act of 48, which brought women in, and then he took it a step further and signed to desegregate the military. So he's bringing in all kinds of minorities in 1948. But the women, they were segregated. So that's why, even though women in the White WAACs had been served overseas, they were working in Australia, Africa. The 688 was the only African American battalion to go over. So, and they had their own chain of command.
Thank you.
You run this organization, you're also a student? Is that what you said you're like an architect, engineer or something?
Yes, I'm studying, well, I'm studying, I graduated in 2023 and now I'm studying for licensure. So I work in historic preservation and architecture. So I'm so for me doing something like Fort Devens or Northampton is a lot of fun because it's both buildings, and I like to walk around with like old photos and see pictures of the women and then try and figure out what that building's still there. So it's kind of a really amazing way to overlap the two things I'm most passionate about. I take that as a good sign. I will be set up in the back there until 3 o'clock, so feel free to come and chat with me, and I'm more than happy to take any other questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.